everybody for attending today and thanking the School of Population and Public Health for allowing me to speak with you today about asbestos and asbestos in the built environment. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today is sort of three main points around asbestos. I want to provide information about the prevalence and types of asbestos products that you might find in construction or building materials. The second point I want to get across is to explain important dates of asbestos production and use in Canada. And then thirdly, to present findings from an internal study that Pinchin conducted that links asbestos use to buildings related to construction year. So as I go through the presentation today, I'd like to sort of keep some key points in the back of your mind as I go through it. And you'll be hearing me talk about all these points throughout the presentation. Number one, asbestos was used widely in building products in Canada. It was really the miracle material that used in virtually so many different products. I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. Exposure to asbestos really is coming through construction activity. So if you're renovating buildings or homes or construction or demolishing those buildings or maintaining those buildings, the risk of exposure to asbestos is definitely higher. And then what happened is in the beginning sort of the mid-1970s, when the public perception of asbestos became more prevalent about the health risks, asbestos use declined and became phased out over time. And you might be surprised to know that asbestos in Canada was not fully banned until 2018. So we're going to do a poll question just to sort of gauge the knowledge of the audience. So you'll launch that. So how much knowledge do you have on building materials or products that contain asbestos? Oh, okay. Is it closed now? Or is that still going? Okay. Well, actually, very good. So we have a lot of people who have moderate to high knowledge, and we have a few experts in the field as well. I'd like to know who you are. Actually, I think I probably recognize some of the names if I look at the list. Well, great. That's great. So now I know sort of what your experience is. So I need to clear this.
You can just clear it. Should say that probably doesn't include a lot of people in this room. So.
Yeah, I'm assuming a lot of people online are probably been doing this for a while.
Not just checking.
Is that good to go?
Still sharing the screen.
It's still up there, but is that okay?
don't see it on my. I don't see it on my computer. So
Yeah, it's not showing up there.
Yeah, the audience is not seeing it. So if you're
It's
able
just the room, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so as I mentioned, asbestos was used widely in Canada, and the reason why asbestos was used is because it really was that magic material, and it had very unique properties when added to building materials. So asbestos added heat resistance to materials when you add it to different products. It made it chemical resistant, it made it more durable, it didn't conduct electricity, it made it stronger. Asbestos actually, weight per weight and size by size, has a higher tensile strength than steel. You might be surprised to find out. And it was also flexible. It could be woven into different materials. And for that reason, there was over 3,000 documented products that were actually installed, that were manufactured with asbestos in this formulation. And the picture on the bottom right, you'll see there's sort of 3 different types of asbestos that were commercially mined. The chrysotile, which is the white one, which is mined primarily in Canada. 90% of the asbestos that was mined in Canada ended up in building products. Amosite and percetolite are the other 2 ones. They're actually called amphiboles, is the technical name. Not mined in Canada. They were mined in South Africa and Australia. Not as common as the chrysotile. So I'm going to run through some asbestos-containing building products that might be common. I might go through this a little bit faster because I know there's lots of people on the call who have seen this before. So because of its fire resistive capabilities, it was added to fireproofing. So fireproofing is a product which is applied to structural steel, concrete, to enhance that fire protection rating on the structure to allow it to stand if there's a fire in a building. And there's 2 sort of main types. There was a fibrous one and then a more of a plastery style cementitious. Both of these are spray applied with sprayed equipment. Pipe insulation, boiler insulation, it was used to prevent heat loss on pipes, mechanical systems, fittings, steam lines, hot water pipes, chilled water pipes, boilers, furnaces, tanks, you name it. It was added to all those materials to help with heat loss. Some other materials which were used was getting into sort of the building material side of things, or the finishes. Drywall joint compound. That is, so when you fill the joints, when you install drywall, you have to fill that joint with some type of, they call it drywall mud, is sort of the nickname. That could contain asbestos. Texture coat. So that is the sort of popcorn ceiling you see in many institutional buildings, even homes, schools. That spray texture coat can contain asbestos to a certain extent. And both of these were added to increase that strength and durability to it. Ceiling tiles. Ceiling tiles in different shapes and sizes. There was the 12 by 12 one, which is the one on the left, which is sort of just glued onto a ceiling. And then you have the other one, which is called the lay-in ceiling tiles, which is pretty much what you see in this room here. It just sits into a T-bar grid. Those can contain asbestos. One thing that we did find through our experience is if the back of the tile has a pink coating to it, that was a manufacturer's sign that it was a fire-rated tile, and it's a good chance that it could contain asbestos. Floor tiles. So floor tiles, the vinyl floor tiles, different colors, different sizes. It was 12 by 12 or 9 by 9 were the most common materials. They were just glued down to the floor. The other one is sheet flooring. Sheet flooring was also used with the backing. So with the resilient backing, there's a paper material applied to the back of sheet flooring, otherwise known as linoleum, which could contain asbestos. Vermiculite is an interesting one. So vermiculite is it's a loose fill insulation that was put into many attics, actually, in homes and also in concrete block walls, masonry walls and cavities to help with heat loss. And the interesting story about vermiculite is that the asbestos wasn't put there on purpose. It was actually a contamination in the mine where it was mined. And it typically came from a place called Libby, Montana, just south of the border here. And it got the nickname Libby amphibole because it's a mixture of different types of asbestos. And the thing is that the manufacturer didn't want to have the asbestos in there because it contaminated the process of the vermiculite, which is basically mica. Then what happened was they tried to remove the asbestos, but they didn't remove it all. So anywhere from 99% to 99.9% was removed, leaving some behind, which causes a problem when you actually deal with the material because it's now sitting in that, mixed into that material and can become airborne when disturbed. Okay, let's do another poll question. Well, Frabble asbestos. So Frabble asbestos means a material that either is highly resistant to damage, can be easily crushed with hand pressure, or is bound tightly with other materials. I think this is an easy one. Okay. So I should leave it up there, okay. So the answer is B, it needs to be crushed with hand pressure. Actually, I need to close this. How do I close it up here? So I lost my notes up here. Okay, all right. So yeah, so the answer is friable asbestos means a material that can be easily crushed by hand pressure. And the reason why that's important is because there's a distinction between friable asbestos and non-friable asbestos. And friable asbestos, because of the fact that it becomes easily crushed by hand pressure, it readily releases asbestos in air when disturbed. And you'll see the picture on the upper right there. There's a picture of like some fireproofing. It's sitting on top of some on the ceiling tiles. You can see that there's some debris there. You can imagine if you're a maintenance worker and you went into that space, you open up that ceiling tile, that falls down on your head, and then there's a likely exposure to asbestos, resulting in a higher airborne concentration. Now, non-friable asbestos, on the other hand, like floor tiles and other materials, it's the material, the asbestos is tightly bound, it's much less resistant to damage, and much less readily available to release asbestos fibers when disturbed, which results in a very lower potential for airborne concentration. So in many cases, you can leave these kind of materials in place until you're actually needing to, renovate or demolish a building. And the regulations around asbestos all relate to the friability, and you'll see that work procedures and handling procedures all relate to that. Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about sort of what I'm going to call miscellaneous non-friable materials. So the materials that I've talked about is primarily what you would find when I first started in the business 37 years ago. That's what we were looking for. But when we started to discover that there's other types of materials that can contain asbestos. Things like window caulking, so around the windows, between the brick and the frame. Sealants around metal panels and where they join together. These were all materials which could contain asbestos.
It's clear now.
Okay. This is there. Guess that's fine. Okay.
Okay, so other types of non-friable asbestos is mastics. So this is something you might find as waterproofing on foundation walls or adhesives on floors. Duct mastics, so to seal that joint. that material could contain asbestos. This is something that we learned about quite recently is butyl seals in windows. So the double glazed windows had a sort of a sticky black material that when sandwiched between the glass created that seal, but that can contain asbestos. And if you look closely at the picture on the right, you'll see that there's a date stamp on that window. It says 1992. And we tested that material and it was asbestos. So asbestos was used in these materials even up until at least 1992 and beyond. Even things like thread sealants on sprinkler lines, also on gas lines, that can contain asbestos. This is something that we ran across in about, I don't know, the last 15 years or so is paint. This was not really on the radar as much as it is now, but asbestos paint could be either in the architectural paint on the outside of buildings, typically on concrete, and it was also a specific product that was made by manufacturers for boiler stacks, coating them with a special paint that contained asbestos because it was because of the high heat on that boiler stack in the petrochemical industry. So lots of materials that can contain asbestos. Here's sort of a screenshot of what types of materials you might find in buildings that can contain asbestos. Just a note on the color coding. So the yellow is the green is the friable materials, the ones that could break down easily. The yellow is the non-friable materials, the ones that don't break down as easily. And then the blue one is what we're calling potentially friable, which means that, you know, if you're going to deal with them, they're probably going to create some type of friable asbestos release. Okay, so another poll question. What year was asbestos banned in Canada? And this one should be easy because I mentioned it at the beginning.
I think some people just want to be difficult.
Okay, so it looks like we're closing the poll. So obviously the correct answer was 2018. However, I can see there is some other answers there, and this is kind of a trick question because there's a lot of false information about things being, asbestos being banned in certain years. And there was a 1990 date that seemed to be proliferating in the industry. Before that was 87, and 74 I'm going to get to in a few minutes. But the right answer is 2018. So let's talk about asbestos production in Canada. So this graph represents asbestos production. So on the x-axis is the year of production between 1886 to 2011. On the y-axis is the weight in tons that were mined in Canada. The large red line is Quebec, which accounts for the vast majority of mining in Canada. The other lines at the bottom are other provinces like Ontario, British Columbia, Newfoundland, and Yukon did actually have mines operating, but at a much less capacity. So you'll see here that the production of asbestos in Canada peaked in about 1973, and then it really dropped down in 2011 when the last mine in Quebec was closed. And you'll see that steady decline from about 1973. There's a little bit of it was a big drop in 74, 75, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And then it goes down until that mine was closed. And as I think I mentioned before, is that Quebec is the one that's mining or did mine, which is the white asbestos, which accounted for 90% of the products that use asbestos in its formulation. So let's talk about sort of a general timeline of control. So that 1973 date is quite important because that was the date where the US EPA banned asbestos spray applied materials. That was accounted for the mass majority of the raw material. And that's why you saw that big valley drop around that time. And then the US EPA followed up a little bit later with banning pipe insulation. And what happened was that it was sort of a trickle down effect into Canada. WorkSafe BC, or WCB as it used to be known, they had a regulation in 1978 that said you can't spray applied asbestos. So that stopped. In 1980, there was a ban on drywall joint compound, which under the Hazardous Product Act, and that stopped. 1985 was friable asbestos on Ontario. You couldn't apply it. So you can see there's all kinds of regional prohibitions and bans. And then there was a nationwide ban in 1989 under spray applied products. And then that mine that I mentioned earlier in Liddy, Montana, they closed in 1990. They didn't mine vermiculite after that point. And then 2011 is when Quebec finally closed their mine. And then that 2018 date, as I mentioned, is the prohibition of asbestos and products containing asbestos regulation, which banned asbestos outright in 2018. Okay, so that's sort of a background on asbestos and what it's used for and kind of the timelines. I'm going to now switch gears a little bit and talk about this asbestos use study that Pinchin conducted. I just wanted to mention that the information provided in this presentation is not to be considered legal or professional advice. It should not be used for regulatory compliance purposes. The content is accurate to the date of this presentation. The information presented is a summary of proprietary information specific to Pinchin testing, and Pinchin will not be held liable for any use or information. Consult a qualified professional for legal or other advice. Okay, so the purpose of the asbestos study that we conducted was to determine the likelihood of asbestos being in certain building materials relative to when it was installed in the building. Because as you can see, there's all kinds of different moving parts when it comes to asbestos and how it was declined in use. And we wanted to do this to be able to have a better understanding of end of use dates and to be able to apply that to our sampling strategies and how we would advise our clients and whatnot. So what we did is the data set was based on commissioned projects that Pinchin conducted. We conducted the study, we finished it in 2023, so just last year, but there was two other studies we conducted earlier in 2011 and 2019 on a smaller scale. So we had some sort of preliminary information about what we thought was asbestos use in certain years. And I should point out that the study was not random, it was systematic. When I say that, I mean that for example, we didn't sample friable materials all the time because we knew that its use became much less after certain time periods. Or we weren't really sampling buildings, the newer buildings, because we just weren't getting asked to. We weren't being commissioned to sample new buildings. And then there's less information around some of that miscellaneous non-friable products that I mentioned, like the caulking and the mastics, and there's sort of less information. So it's not totally randomized. Some of the variables we looked at, so we looked at the building construction date. So what year was the building constructed? Where is it located? What province is it in? What is the building material type? Is it drywall joint compound? Is it vinyl floor tiles? Is it texture coat? The friability, which I mentioned before, and the laboratory result. So whether it's asbestos or not. We studied 30,000 buildings in Canada, representing 307,000 samples of asbestos. So the distribution of materials, this is just a graph showing the relative distribution of the materials that we tested. Drywall joint compound representing the vast majority at 72,000 samples, followed up by vinyl floor tile at 43,000, and so on and so forth. Really, the reason why drywall joint compound was sampled so much is because every building has drywall in it, and there's lots of it, so we end up sampling it quite frequently. Here is a distribution of the number of samples collected on a provincial basis. So Ontario and British Columbia represented the vast majority of samples. A couple reasons for that. Ontario being higher population than in Canada, just more buildings. And then British Columbia, because there's a very high awareness, regulatory framework, and compliance around asbestos in the workplace when it comes to dealing with asbestos. And that's why there's more samples collected in British Columbia. So if we look at the distribution of samples by year of construction, so we've got the 307,000 samples that were collected. We collected, this is between years of buildings that were built between about 1900 to about 2000 in this case. But you see the vast majority lies within a period of time about 1945 to about 1990. That's what that dotted red line represents. And the reason for that is because that's when asbestos was used the most. And then if we look at the number of positive samples, it's kind of mirroring the same thing. So out of that 307,000 samples, 50,000 were positive for asbestos, 17% positive rate. So relatively high. So 17% of the samples were determined to contain asbestos. And you'll see some peaks there in 1960 and 1970, and it kind of tails off towards the 1980s and then into the 1990s. And if I sort of overlay that graph that I showed earlier about the asbestos production in Canada, which is a red line, over our study with the positive results, you'll see that there's a definite trend there. It's sort of following that same curve where asbestos production is relating to asbestos in buildings, which obviously kind of makes sense. But that study sort of confirmed that. So let's look at some specific examples of materials. So that sprayed fireproofing that I mentioned at the very beginning, between 1945 and 1990, we collected about 5,900 samples, 702 were positive, representing a 12% positive rate. And you'll see that peak in 1970, and then kind of a definite tail down towards 1980s. And this really corresponds to that ban in USA, and then which started in 1973, and then worked its way into Canada very shortly thereafter. Pipe insulation. Pipe insulation between 1950 and 1990, we collected 1,560 samples. 1,000 were asbestos containing, 65%, pretty high. You see some peaks in the 1960s and just before 1970. It really became insignificant after about 1980. The reason why it's so high, we think, is because when asbestos was used, when pipe insulation was used during that time period, it was almost always asbestos. Like there was never non-asbestos, very, very rarely to be non-asbestos in that time period, because it was just, that's the time period that it was used. And we sort of focused our sampling around that time period. Texture coat, between 1945 and 2000 year construction, 11,000 samples collected. 3,300 positive, being a 29% positive rate. And you'll see that peak again in 1970. So that would have been, in buildings that was applied at the most around the 1970s. And it really came a decline, and you see that decline going down pretty much insignificant after about 1987. Vermiculite, this is that loose fill insulation that I mentioned earlier that typically came from Libby, Montana. Pretty high positive rate, very high, 72%. And the reason, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but the reason why that is because of when it was used, it all came from Libby, Montana, which is that mine that I mentioned earlier. So we actually looked at it on sort of a regional basis. So vermiculite, which was mined typically in North America from this mine in Libby, Montana, being in Western United States, the majority of those materials, the raw product, was shipped to Western Canada. So you'll see that there is a very high positive rate for BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, being almost anywhere from 90 to 100%. Whereas when they were shipping it to Eastern Canada, there was other sources that were coming into Eastern Canada, typically from South Africa, and their mine was not contaminated with asbestos. So then what we found was in Ontario, about half the time, or 42% of the time, it was asbestos containing. So less of a rate there in Ontario. Okay, I think this is the last poll question. What year was asbestos stop being used in drywall joint compound in Canada? Looks like the last question should say 2018, but a typo there on the last one. That's okay. So 1974, 1980, or 1990, or 2018. So the correct answer is 1980. Okay. That was when the drywall ban came into place under the Hazardous Product Act in Canada. And I see a lot of people actually answered 1990, which is actually not totally incorrect, because there was potentially some non-compliance with the regulation, and it wasn't really well publicized that regulation was in place. And then also being the drywall door and compound being sort of in the supply chain, sitting in warehouses for many years after that date, and used potentially after that date. But the correct answer, the official answer is 1980. And let's talk about drywall. So between 1950 and 2010, year of construction, 63,000 samples collected, 12,800 were positive, so about a 20% positive rate. And you'll see the peaks in the 1970s, and then a significant drop off around 1980, down to about 1990, a couple little blips in there. And that is probably relating to, like I mentioned, non-compliance with the regulation, old stock sitting in warehouses, workers being unaware that it could contain asbestos because it wasn't labeled as such back then. So there's lots of reasons why drywall joint compound, even though it was banned in 1980, it could have actually ended up beyond that date to be asbestos containing. Vinyl floor tile, between 1940 and 2010, about 42,000 samples collected, 8,000 positive, 20% positive rate. So pretty significant. 1950s to 1985, some peaks there, and then really became insignificant after about 1992. Duct mastic. So this is the materials that seals the joints on ducts. Between 1945 and 1990, about 10,000 samples collected, 1,200 were positive, about 12% positive rate. Some peaks in the 70s and 80s, but then it became much less significant after about 1985. So duct mastic was definitely used later in the sort of era than the other materials that I just talked about. And it's really the same story with caulking. Really, there were some big peaks in the 1960s and 1970s, and then it became much less used after about 1990. But we still found, some positive results even into the late 1990s. So that is something that we've discovered as part of our study. So I think I'm getting close to my presentation. I have 2 more slides left. So in my concluding statements is that, number 1, asbestos was used extensively in the built environment, peaking in the 1970s. Number 2, friable asbestos is more likely to be used in older buildings. I'm going to say pre-1985. Asbestos in the built environment is less common in buildings constructed after 1990, all non-friable. So what that means in effect is that the potential for exposure to asbestos for workers is much higher in older buildings where friable asbestos is more common because of that reason that I described earlier. So this is my last slide. So what's the next steps here? Well, we want to continue the study. The study is not done. At Pinchin, we collect about 2,000 to 3,000 samples per month across Canada, and those are all going continually into our database, so we can analyze this again. We want to try and study more newer build dates. We are getting commission now to test buildings that are much newer, just because of what's as far as being more information now about people realizing that there could be asbestos beyond certain dates. So we want to try and fill that sort of data gap, and then continue to advise on standards. I've had discussions with WorkSafe BC about the regulation. I've talked to AIHA, which you're familiar with, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, at the presentation to them. I've talked to Canadian Mesothelioma Foundation about the findings, and I was one of the key informants on that. It's a CSA standard, which is trying to establish a national standard for asbestos management in Canada. And that document is available online if you want to look at it, and you'll see some of the discussion points that I brought up in today's meeting. So the ultimate goal of what I'm trying to do here is to make this awareness out there, and then to eliminate asbestos exposure in the workplace. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.